Here I am, Marcus, looking as scruffy and dishevelled as ever. One of the good things about being able to work from home, hey? But today I'm going to be talking about where are women in history. I'm going to start off with one of my favourite women academics, the marvellous Mary Beard. I've been nosing around this book. I gobbled it up sometime, maybe this time last year, I'm not sure. There's a lot of markings in there that I didn't notice yet. So she says here, looking at harder at Greece and Rome, which of course is what Adrienne May is doing when she's looking at the Amazons and the Greek representation of the Amazons, helps us to look harder at ourselves and to understand better how we have learned to think as we do. She's placing, you might say, the current Me Too and so on movements in a broader historical context. This book is called Women and Power, a Manifesto, and it's updated. It says updated there. I've just gone and put in a request at the library, get it and make Chapter 1, The Public Voice of Women, available, simply because it's a great example of how a historian, and Mary Beard is a classicist. She is an historian of the classic period, particularly famous for her television appearances in regards to introducing us to Rome, and particularly the social history of Rome. She's fantastic. And the other thing about Mary is that she refuses to glamorize herself. She looks like a woman who's, 4 years older than me or something like that. And she makes no excuses for it. She doesn't, do herself up. In fact, she refused to when she was asked by, I'm not sure if it was BBC or somebody, one of those broadcasting companies, to make herself a little bit more glamorous, you might say. And she told them to bugger off, basically, which I think is terrific. So I'm going to, I'm recording, I'm going to share screen, and we're going to rip into this fantastic subject. Now, I use women in history, Amazons as a subject, of course. It's so much fun reading that chapter from Adrienne May's book on the Amazons, called Trapped in Patterns of Thinking, Analysis and Research, Scholarship and so on. There's Grace. Oh, I saw Grace. And that those patterns are deeply entrenched. Mary Beard makes the point in her book, but Adrienne May is constantly referencing the Greeks, and particularly Greek misogynistic attitude towards women and so on. But we'll get to that. Now, you saw that I had Adrienne May there, and not Adrienne, Grace Holmes there. So we might as well jump to that, and to the only quote from this book of Mary Beard's that I am using. She says, Mary says that my aim, stop that, here is to take a long view historical view on the culturally awkward relationship between the voice of women spoke, but their speaking was legitimate simply because of the cultural context in which they were set. Mary Beard does a really great job of illustrating that. But we have a very Eurocentric, androcentric, that means male-centered, politics-centered form of history that we've all inherited. We'll come to that, though, in a little while. What I'm doing here, this issue of where are women in history, we could also be saying, well, where are kangaroos in history? Where are the indigenous history? Where are, and so on. I could add any number of adjectives to describe, well, what kind of history are we doing? Environmental history, indigenous history, black history, gendered history, feminist history, female history, which I don't see as the same thing as feminist. and so on. So there are all these subcategories. Of course, we're children in history. And then, of course, we can talk about different foods in history. We can talk about any multitude of things. All right. So what we have is a historiographical problem, you would have to say, a problem of, how do we do a more inclusive history? That's really behind much of what I'm going to be covering today. Though I'll try to stay as well as I can, given that I do tend to wander. I apologize for that, and meander, because there's so many points of intersection here. And that's why history is all about reading, and it's constant reading. You've got to just constantly keep on exploring this and that. I grab my National Geo history magazines. I've got a pile of them down next to me here. Or, I will read something online. I'll watch a YouTube clip. I put up new YouTube clips at the end of the extended reading session on the Scythians, which me for years. That one of the things just for fun, because they're wonderful examples of. I'll just put that over here. I'm hotspotting off my phone, which was right next to the computer. That's why my dog was barking at us. And the phone always waits for me to do one of these recordings before it does that. Don't know how it has this intuitive ability, but it does. Anyway, let's keep moving. So let's turn to that first reading. I hope you all enjoyed it. I specifically chose to enter with the practice of a woman looking at a woman's issue, the Amazons, through a particularly elegant written style, very approachable. She's not at all academic in that heavy sense of the word. She's not theorizing, she's doing history. She's handling evidence. She's saying, look, we've got some of this, we've got that. We've got a whole bunch of the things that make for the good history. She's offering us a reasonably objective position, but she is a woman doing women's history or feminist history or female history, perhaps is a better word for it. And, she makes no excuse for that. She's not apologetic. But she's also not seeking to justify her approach. She's just doing some history, you might say. But some of the things that arise from that work is that we can see tensions between the mythic and the factual. We can see, particularly she's really good at demonstrating the androcentric, that means the male-centric perspective of the Greeks. And yet there's this kind of ambivalence that, there's a male-centrism, but the Greeks are also fascinated by the idea of free women, presumably also free sex, which tends to fascinate most people, I think, at some people, and terrify them simultaneously. She gives us a lot of stuff on Scythians and gender equity and gender parity. The male-woman sort of heterosexual divide that we have today is not so clear in the ancient world. It wasn't even clear in the Greek world, where particularly homosexuality, up until a certain point in a man's life, was understood as part of their training. With the Scythians, we can see, as she demonstrates, a much more egalitarian approach to gender and sexuality. Women were warriors. And, with that came rights, responsibilities, and so on. So she works between evidence and inference. That means, well, when we don't have clear evidence, how do we connect the dots? How do we join things together, create what we might call a historical causal narrative? All right. So she's doing a whole bunch of these things. And, it's really a great way to start looking at this question of where are women in history. But we also have to theorize it. We have to look at the problems of the historical process as we have them today, and as we've inherited it, should I say. So I put up, as I've noticed there in the last bullet point, these YouTube clips, and they're there for you at the end of the God, let's have to silence my phone. It's really picking up on this. Yeah, all right, so let's keep moving. So continuing with Adrienne Mayer's work, she's talking about the psychosocial explanations focus on the drastic scenes of violence toward strong foreign women in Greek myth and art. So if we flick back to the front here, we got Achilles, killing the Amazon queen, for instance. And as he kills her, in the Iliad, there's this particularly beautiful passage where Achilles actually regrets doing so. Because she's a fantastic specimen, you might say, but she's also represents something that Achilles really admires. All right, so you can go and explore that further. Greek myths are unique in their insistence on the death of Amazons, as in that vase that I showed you at the opening slide. But this focus misses the bigger story. This bigger story, of course, is really what the historian is looking for. The mythic formula is radically at odds with the more realistic, even-handed descriptions of Amazon warrior women by Greco-Roman historians, geographers, and ethnographers. And their accounts share much in common with the tales of non-Greek cultures. So there is parity between the Greek accounts of the Amazon and the non-Greek, let's say the Persians, for instance, that met Scythian horse archers in the battlefield. All right, so she's saying, look, we've got the psychosocial Greek commentators, particularly in the arts and the broader cultural sphere, who are kind of both shocked by the Amazon women, attracted to them, disapproving. Culturally, the Greeks like to keep them, were men who kept their women at home in seclusion and so on. The Greek woman was totally the antithesis of the Amazon woman, which makes the Amazon woman somewhat alluring to the Greek male. But, and this is where she turns to other sources, let's say Herodotus and his wonderful story of the Scythian, the Amazon women who were kidnapped by Greeks, eventually got free from them, and ended up going off and having sort of lovely love making with a bunch of young urbanized Scythian men called the Royal Scythians. That's right. So she gives us this other sort of story in her book. Can't remember where that comes now, but it doesn't matter. So let's keep moving. But there's this interesting tension, and I think that's something that historians are always dealing with. Let's turn to another historian who's dealing with tension. So Rihanna Eisler, whom I cite in a moment, she's seen patterns in history. She sees patterns between gender equality and gender inequality, between violence and non-violence. It typifies in her own book, The Chalice and the Blade, which I don't cite directly. No, actually, I do. It's a book that used to be a reading for this course, but I've reduced the reading down to a couple a week because you guys seem to be faint-hearted and don't remember that history is all about reading and thinking and exploring. But anyway, that's me sort of popping on my little pedestal. So push me off. Whenever anybody gets on a pedestal, it's always good to push them off. But Rihanna Eisler is really interesting because she sees in this pattern a pattern between dominated societies and partnership societies, which at some point in her work she calls the androcratic, which is the dominator, male, heterosexual, whites, that's me, type thing at the top and everybody else down the bottom, people of colour particularly, and partnership societies in which men and women, like the Scythians, work together and share responsibility, power, and so on. And she sees across time that there are periods when we have dominator societies and when we have partnership societies. This is one way of representing that historiographically. And what she's pointing out is that at the moment, I'm now looking towards the right of this diagram, we have a bifurcation. We have a tension where we're working between heavily fundamentalist, desensitized, annihilating forms of social expression. I mean, killing nature, killing one another, sending drone strikes, suicide bombing, all of that sort of stuff. And the other side is this movement towards greater inclusiveness, challenging old patterns of political and economic behavior, where we're looking for something that is much more partnership, much more peace-oriented. Rihanna Eisler is not the only person that I cite in this particular talk on who comes from that peace background. One woman that I particularly like, and she's been, she's just up there for me. She's been dead for about 20 years, is Elise Boulding, and I'm going to refer to her book, which is also was a reading, was past tense, for this particular course for this week. You'll find, and I went through and I pulled all the readings on women into a new section in the course readings called Women or something like Feminist Writings. I forget what I called it, but it's a new section. It's got the 4 in there, one of which is the Rihanna Eisler, another one being this Elise Boulding that I'm going to refer to. But let's stay here. So what we have is patterning in history between partnership and dominator, okay? And Eisler makes a very interesting case, not a watertight case, because when you seek patterns, you're always in danger of simplifying things too much. But there is a certain power to her reading of historical processes over time. Now, one of the other people who used to be part of this reading, but is no longer, is Hardwick here. Can't think of her first name. What was her first name? Can't remember. Where she treats the question, did gender have a renaissance? And she goes through this beautiful social history. It's one of the readings that are now in that new section for extended readings. And she basically points out that people living in the early modern period saw gender and family patterns as integral elements of authority structures of all kinds. What does she mean? Well, she basically means that the unit of the family with the male head, the wife, and the kids represents or reflected or was metaphorical for the way that society was organized, with a monarch at the top and everybody else sort of in orders below that. Caste, class, whatever you want to call it, depends on what part of the world you're in. But she was looking at European history, made a very good case in this little article of hers, this chapter, for the fact that the family unit acted as a model for the political, or the political acted as a model for the family, that they mutually reinforce one another. Okay, increasingly gender became a very key determinant of power generally, and political and civil rights in particular. We can see that and in this period of, let's say, particularly the 16th and 17th century. It's a little bit related than the Renaissance, but the Renaissance did last longer in the north of Europe, where you have these tensions between the Catholic and the Protestants. And then there were also economic and social tensions emerging. And one of the prime victims of those economic and social tensions were women, particularly women who were cast as witches. And this is the period of the witch craze. If you want to look at the witch craze, there are no direct references to it in this particular week, but you couldn't do better than turn to the work of Carlo Ginzburg. Okay, Carlo Ginzburg does wonderful analyses of the social conditions that sort of generate socio-political conditions, theological conditions, and so on, that generated the witch crazes. We have Elizabeth I of England here, being extraordinarily androgynous. Power, she held on to power in a way by massaging and managing her own image, the way people perceived her. Hardwick talks about Elizabeth towards the end of her chapter. I recommend the chapter to you, especially if you want a beautiful example of really thorough, historical writing, where she uses historical examples all the way through. She talks about the mother and 2 daughters who were, tried and executed as witches towards the end of it. For instance, she actually goes into the social history in a beautiful way. Marriage patterns are particularly key to demonstrating that gender didn't have a renaissance. In fact, it went backwards in European contexts following the Reformation and the Renaissance, as women became part of an economic order that was particularly stratified, almost like classes and so on. Now, Therese Eisler, whom I mentioned earlier, she's the Chalice and the Blade Lady. I'm just going to move myself out of the way here so you can see that without being shot or bayoneted by these guys over here. So I've chosen a particularly male type of image of the past and history and so on, with flags and swords and guns and smoke and everything. So Eisler points out this is, at the beginning of one of her chapters, it was the chapter I think that I scanned for you guys long ago, or not for you, but for previous people of this course. History, as taught in most schools, is largely a matter of the struggle for power among men and nations. I want to flag that she wrote this book in the 1980s, okay? So, there is a little bit of dating here. It's not quite so bad today, but it's still very much that history is taught along very linear lines, and that those linear lines tend to focus on the political and generally on men as well. It is the dates of battles and the names of kings and generals noted for alternately constructing or destroying fortresses, palaces, and religious monuments, blah, 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 okay? But if we look again at history, okay, and this is the backdrop to what I'm trying to sort of communicate to you in this lecture or talk. If we look again at the history in light of the new information we've examined, this is like chapter 10, so she's covered a bunch of stuff on women in history, partnership models versus dominator models, and so on. The new theoretical framework, that's that image that I showed you earlier, a couple of slides before, that she's been developing, a very different kind of struggle emerges. It's a struggle between two ways of social organization, two ways that are fundamentally different. One seeks to dominate the world, exploit it, extract stuff. It's very much the capitalist model today, the nation state model today, worried about GDP and so on, and the partnership model, which is a totally different way of organizing the world and understanding our past as well as our present and, of course, our future. She's very clear that the way we tell our histories is the way we imagine our futures. Both of them are plural. So now to my hero, Elise Boulding. Okay, I'm actually quoting a number of her passages from her long work. I'm doing so in a very naked, without, I'm not naked, of course. The slides themselves are naked, okay, so that, you can just look at this and go, okay, sampling. And I really like the way she opens this massive book she wrote called The Underside of History. And it's the history of women in across time. She says, look, history is a problem of sampling. Now, this is a really interesting way of approaching the issue of David Irving and, the problems raised by Rursson and Clendenin and so on. It's really, really interesting. History is a problem of sampling. Well, what do we sample? Where do we turn for evidence? Do we just turn to the Greek myths and say that Amazons are fictitious, or do we look at archaeology and so on? That's one simple example. Depending on the point in time at which one considers that one's ancestors became fully human, so she's now looking at the 1 to 2 million years of human prehistory, there have been somewhere between 60 and 77 billion of us around the world, okay? Now, if you look at the time for this one, this is a 1978 quote. She's one of the earliest to take women's studies into, take it seriously, but to also give it start grounding it theoretically. So, wonderful stuff. So there's been, let's say 70, let's say now 100 billion people have been on the planet, women and men, okay? Leaving an infinite variety of gossamer social webs to girdle the planet. That wonderful variety actually is what highlight and pull out this big fat book, The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. Fantastic text. They make the same point, you know, but this book came out last year, 2021, that there is this infinite variety of social possibilities, social webs, okay, that we all weren't just sort of faceless beings, that every human being who has lived has felt, experienced, hoped, feared, aspired to certain things, attempted, failed, succeeded, who knows, you know, that there is so many different ways. And then when we come together, there are so many groups of people. If we just look at the way that, you know, the civilizations that have emerged independent of one another have all solved problems in different ways, but with some similarities. Let's say, why are the pyramids so ubiquitous across the planet? That's a very interesting question. Is it that human beings have certain forms wired into their brain? It's hard to say. And it's not a question for right now either. But the point that I'm talking to now is that this variety, one of the things about male history is that it tends to boil history down and the past down to struggles between power elites. There's a lot more to things than that. All the lovely voyeuristic stuff on, you know, different periods of art or architecture and so on. So let's continue then with this. It's still on the same page. There's a few lines in between. Is anyone wandering, I really like this, in the bookstores of Stockholm or Brussels, Frankfurt or Chicago, looking for history books, will find hundreds on the history of Western civilization. Well, we love ourselves, right? Look in the looking glass, and only dozens on the history of the rest of the world. Yet most of the human beings who have walked through history have lived elsewhere. They have lived all over the planet, of course, but most have lived in Asia. The sampling, again, this problem of sampling of human experience in our history books is, in short, very poor. Okay, not only is it poor because it excludes people from Asia, by and large, it also excludes people with disabilities, gender divergence, of course, women, excludes nature, and many other things as well. So, you know, there is a bias at work here. So Euro and anthropocentrism. As she sort of lays out the structure for her book, she also makes this point. So this is on page 2, but goes across to page 3. It would not matter so much, she points out, that those of us who live in the West focus on our own recent corner of history if we kept it in a proper perspective. In other words, if we allowed all these others in. But of course, we do not. I really like the way she writes. Very clear, very crisp. We have created a myth called the evolution of mankind from our fragments. One of the many strange things about this myth is that it does not include women. The history of humankind has been written as if it were the history of Western man. All right, that's quite true. And really, this is something that these guys do very, very well as well. This is trying to make it so that you can see it a little bit, at least the dawn of everything. I should actually slip that. I've got a chapter for my History 140 class from them, so I should slip that into the extra reading just in case one of you might be, what's Marcus talking about there? I want to go and find out more about that. I promote and admire curiosity. It's one of the most important things. And even though you might not be able to get through it, go and download it so that when you finish the course and you've got nothing to do over Christmas, you can go and read it. So getting carried away again. History of humankind is written as though it was the history of man. Yes. Now that's really true. But the reason why I was waving the book around the dawn of everything is because they make exactly the same point that, you know, we've found lots of very, very interesting archaeological evidence for early hominids, early human presence in Europe. We've found these fantastic caves, Lascaux and Altamira and places like that. Found a lot of genetic evidence from early archaeological sites and so on. But the point that these guys make 40 years, 50 years after Baldwin was at work is that, hey, we've been finding a lot of stuff on the European sort of early hominids and so on, but that's only because, one, the Europeans have more money, two, they have more time, they have the focus to fund centres to go and do archaeological work and paleontological work, and so on. So it's really important that we see that. And that's calling me again. All right. So, it's this anthropocentrism and Eurocentrism is a very strong dimension of the historiographical problem. It's also a problem that we face here in Australia with our focus on the last 250 years, as opposed to the last 60, 70,000 years. All right. So I think this is the last of my slides from Elise Boulding's work. Still, I'm only in the very, very first pages here. Oh, one of the things I liked very much about her work was that, she characterizes it as, searching for, that which we cannot see, that which is not explicit. Why? Because of our cultural lens, because of that Eurocentric, anthropocentric conditioning of our research itself. So she points out that the status of women, as many scholars have noted, is indeed a useful indicator for how society is doing in its historical enterprise of making humans more humane. Women, education, children, nature. The treatment of what we might call marginal or excluded figures in the social process is indeed a marker for social well-being. That's another way of phrasing what she says here. And then she turns explicitly to her own work. The book has been written out of a Western tradition of thought, historical in other words, but looks to a future, and I think this is beautiful, when all the major cultural traditions on the planet will be drawn on to delineate the shapes of women's roles in human society. She is not a feminist like Joan Scott is, and we'll be turning to her work very shortly, but she is bringing the feminine in as an inclusive dimension to research. Very similar to what Rhiannon Eisler was doing with her work, seeking to see patterns, partnership patterns. She was writing in the decades before Rhiannon Eisler, okay? And, her work I find Elise Boulder's work quite inspirational. In fact, one of the things I like most about her is that she isn't constrained by her own disciplinary interests. I have a cookbook from the same period, 1970s, that was edited by Elise Boulding. It's also worth noting that Elise Boulding's husband, Kenneth Boulding, if you go and look him up, is a Nobel laureate in economics. So a very interesting person. So let's look at Joan Scott. So Joan Scott is, her writing is a landmark writing in what we might call feminist historiography. And she points out that women's history does not have a long-standing or definable historiographic tradition. She's writing 10 years after Boulding. But you need to note that Scott is also one of the contributors to the reading from last week with Ethan Kleinberg and co. Their theses on theory and history. So she's still alive and working today, though, of course, she's at the end of her career, where this basically set her career up, this book that she wrote, which is just a fantastic work. So, there's women's history doesn't have any kind of long-standing definable historiographic tradition, okay? Instead, the subject of women has been grafted onto other traditions or studied in isolation from them. She particularly, and this is something that I've hammered on about a lot, not in this course, but in other courses, the tension between descriptive history, this is the way it happens, storytelling, and theoretical history, which is, here we have some description, let's unpack it. Let's ask what are our, how are biases, how are ideological, theoretical, methodological things, not necessarily always skewing. I have no problems with someone being a feminist or a Marxist or postmodernist, post-structuralist, or even a traditional historian, as long as, and I think I've got to flick back one, we understand that each historian needs to own up to their own position, that there needs to be reflexivity, as I call it there. Okay. So continuing with Joan Scott, she says, look, an interest in class, race, and gender signaled first the scholars' commitment to a history that included stories of the oppressed. Now, the word that I think is really important here is not so much the words I've bolded, class, race, and gender, but this word signaling. That signaling is the hallmark of reflexivity, saying that, look, I'm interested in looking at the effects of male power on women. How does it skew history? Or you might actually say, I want to look at the role of women in a specific country. How were they treated in Cambodia or Nigeria? How were they treated by the ancient Romans? Mary Beard, and so on. To actually look at the ways in which we problematize an issue. Ancient Rome, or any ancient civilization, any modern civilization, is so complex, you can't cover it all. So we do need to take very specific approaches. The political approach of analysing, let's say, the Roman Civil War period between, Sulla and, Augustus, for instance, is a specific period of time that can be looked at from a political power position. Looking at the various battles, the various players, the interest groups, how they lobbied, manipulated, assassinated one another, and so on. But that's really one very thin slice of what Rome was. And one of the things I like about Mary Beard and the fact that she's such a television star is that she'll walk you around the back streets of the Rome that still exists. But because she has the historian's mind, she will tell you things about what it was like to live in ancient Rome in the year 1, for instance, when Augustus was in power still. So, Joan Scott's talking about an interest in oppression and forms of oppression. It's not just women that are oppressed, classes and races are oppressed. She's writing in 1988. I would certainly add the environmental nature, or what do we want to call that, other half of culture is, nature is certainly oppressed as well. Okay, so where did she go? Scholarly understanding of these inequalities of power are organised along at least these, that means class, race, and gender. I would add environment, 3 axes. Okay, that was, again, written in 1988. Fantastic sculpture of an Amazon thumping a Greek warrior. So it became popular around the 1970s to start talking about her story as opposed to his story. It's a neat play on words, of course. Etymologically, it totally fails, but it conveys something that history was this time, but it's still very much today a male business in terms of the preoccupations of the historian, and of course the historically minded public that have been trained through primary and secondary schools, probably not done history at a university. So if you say to people, I'll grab one now, the National Geo History magazines, it's all about, Magellan, who were the Celts, the constant one, Agrippina, the Roman empress, and so on. It's very much a certain style of doing history. It's very descriptive, it's very narrative, it's not particularly theoretical. I just find it, for when I want to do something light, I'll just grab one of those magazines and have a read because it's fun. I'm reading it with my historical consciousness, which means that I'm not taking it at face value. But it's very easy to read history as though you're reading a novel, that the past is some other place. Oh, look at that, they used to eat one another. Or, oh, look at that, they used to throw Christians to the lions, or whatever it might be. Really bald statements that you might log away in here so that you can quote this or cite that. Not particularly historical, just good at marshalling narrative elements, you could call them, the Amazons. Who were they? Oh, they were Scythians. That might be the end of the story. But, you know, if you read and you take in the work of Adrian Mayer's work, stuff on the Amazons, then you can start nuancing it. So let's look at what Joan Scott has to say about her story. The her story approach has had important effects on historical scholarship, okay? But it's done so in certain ways that are not necessarily getting to the root of the problem. By piling up the evidence about women in the past, it refutes the claims of those who insist that women had no history, no significant place in the stories of the past. The her story's position also does this. It goes further. It alters some of the standards of historical significance, asserting that the personal and subjective experience matters as much as public and political activities. Okay, indeed, the former influenced the latter, and the latter would influence the former as well, of course. So, you know, what bringing this question of the her story into account does is it actually brings in, allows us to explore emotions in history, which I think is next week's subject. It allows us to look at a range of what were previously marginalized or unaccounted for elements of the past. Children in history, the relationship between children and their families, particularly their parents and so on. So this is important. So, but it's done so by piling up the evidence. My National Geo magazine I just picked up with the story of Agrippina. There's a Bolshevik woman from 2,000 years ago. You wouldn't have wanted to mess with her. No way. So, if you read Scott closely, you'll notice that she moves from her story to social history. Okay, so what is social history? Well, social history was, you know, the flavor of the month when I did my undergraduate work 40 years ago now. So social history is ultimately about the processes or systems, capitalism, modernization, depending on the theoretical stance that you take. But it is told through the lives of particular groups of people, like these women here, okay, who are the ostensible, though not always the actual subjects of the narrative. Social history tends to take an individual like these women here, but then it sort of levels them all out and merges them all into the impact of industrialization or the factory system on people. Okay, since human relationships of all kinds constitute society, Scott observes, one can study a variety of groups and topics to assess the impact of processes like industrialization of change. And it is relatively easy to extend that list from the worker, the peasant, or the slave, elites, and diverse occupational or social groups to include women. So women can become part of social history, a category of a subcategory, you could say. She's not all in favor of that. She's saying, look, it's got real benefits. Social history is wonderful, actually, you know, to look at the role of and the experiences of the peasants in the decades leading up, French peasants in the decade leading up to the French Revolution, to look at, you know, any group of people through a social history lens is really beneficial. Social history really became part of the, you know, the historical landscape, probably in the 1930s, 2030s. And it sort of jutted to not a complete halt across the Second World War, mainly because the Germans didn't like social historians, and social historians didn't seem to like, well, I shouldn't say Germans as much as Nazis. Where do I go? I'll go down here. They didn't like them. So, you know, some of them, many of the prominent social historians were French. They joined the French resistance, and some of them got captured and shot, like one of my other heroes, Marc Bloch, who wrote this fabulous 2-volume set on feudal society. I did have a copy of Marc Bloch's something floating around here that I was waving at you guys or somebody in one of my talks some weeks ago. Where is it? There it is. Marc Bloch, The Historian's Craft. Okay, this is the sort of book that, you know, if I had another lifetime, I would love to spend, you know, a whole course just unpacking chapter after chapter. But anyway, we'll keep moving. All right, so we're getting towards the end here. Hopefully you're hanging on and sort of not going gaga. People without a history. Another way of looking at marginalized groups like women. Judith Zinser, a really good historian who is, is pretty annoyed at world historians and big historians. So she takes exception to the course that I also teach, History 140, for instance. Why? Because we tend to sort of border, the face of the individual gets lost completely, and the face of even specific groups of people get lost. It all becomes just about, it's like an extension of the social historians' work, looking at capitalism and industrialization and so on. It's now evolutionary sort of stuff, which obviously makes individual groups and so on invisible. So Judith Zinser points out, and this reading is in the extended reading section under the women. Okay, it was again part of one of the early iterations of this course. Okay, you can see that I keep on changing things around. It keeps me alert, but it also, I'm trying to sort of meet your needs, the students' needs, without sort of doing you completely in. Though it's, it's hard not to when, where this course is asking you to think in ways that only, given that you've done 2 to 3 years of university history, you should all be able to find places where you can anchor yourself. So it is a fact worthy of Leopold von Ranke's most stringent guidelines. Ranke was the guy who almost created history, who created the way we think about history as, about facts leading to data and so on. He was a 19th century German historian, as you could probably guess from his name, a very important thinker in the emergence of history as a discipline. But, for Ranke, facts are the stuff of history. Okay, but that women are and have been half of humanity, and thus their past lives constitute half of what we would call world history. But she continues to if you look at the index of a book, and she's talking about, I think, William McNeill's book on world history, came out in 1963, perhaps. If you turn to the index of that early world history survey by a leading authority, and she had a lot of respect for William McNeill, and he traveled a long way in his career as a historian. He's now dead. His son John McNeill is probably in his 60s or 70s, and they produced a book that I still use in my History 140 course. So anyway, even by leading authority, readers found the names of individual women, particularly those who became political rulers, but neither they nor concerns traditionally associated with women constitute anywhere near half of the content of that particular book. So Judith, since I look at that, I haven't put in the date there. It shows you where I was at. Oops. Okay, Zinser, 2010, I think it is, that she was writing this particular one. I'll have to go and check that and correct this before I make the slides available to you. So again, you have a people without a history. In other words, half of humanity is without a history. That's women. But of course, then you could do subsets of that: women in ancient Egypt, women in Rome, women in the Maya or the Inca civilizations, women in Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, women in Australia, and so on. So we've got any number of areas that you can go and explore. And the point, of course, is that the more fine grain you get, the more diversity you get. We can't just do women in history. We can talk about oppressive mechanisms within history. We can talk about the theory of history and the practice of history as excluding certain, key interest groups because of the dominant interest group that's writing or creating that history. All of that is perfectly valid. But, the point is that with history, there's, you open one door and you close 3 others as you go into the history labyrinth. That you can be constantly and should be constantly questioning your own practice. And of course, really, that's what this course is about, the questioning of our own practice. So last slide, just check. Yes, it is the last slide. Some lovely young women in the Second World War, working in the as engineers in the military, arming bombs and whatever else. So they are doing blokey sort of work, aren't they? Tends not to be what's the word, flagged too much, other than in the sense that the war created new opportunities for different peoples. But you can imagine that this woman arming that bomb there, 10 years hence, let's say 1952, 3, 4, 5, stuck in the 1950s, where we saw a swing back to deeply conservative family structures, she would have lost considerable amount of her autonomy during that decade, only to regain it again in the 60s as we, as you know, society swings to and fro between, like a pendulum, between various forms of social expression. 4 points I want to make. Traditional history has been shaped and warped both by specific cultural biases of its white, male, heterosexual, and European writers. New forms of history are determined by the specific interests of concerned researchers. So, you know, queer history, history of, you know, alternative sexualities is, something that has marked the last 15 to 20 years, as have Indigenous histories, female histories, feminist histories, and so on. Why? Because researchers coming from those perspectives bring those interests to their research and those concerns. It has the effect of balancing out imbalances. We will always be trying to balance out imbalances. There's no, being balanced can often mean being static, boring, and basically just stuck. We don't want to be that either. So keep questioning, challenging one's own biases, but also looking for the new. The third point, a complete history will always elude us. Oh, I just said that. As being human is not a static condition, but one in which the preoccupations and concerns of the day shape the focus and nature of the research and researchers. Final point, her story is just one of the many routes to a more inclusive approach to our human and more than human past and present, and I have to say in futures if I think about it. So that's my take on the readings for this week, plus a whole slab of extra readings. If any of you are looking at Where Are Women in History for your final assessment, definitely go and have a look at those extra readings there, and hopefully the Mary Beard will become available. If not, let me know, and I might have to go and scan it and illicitly sneak it into the course modules. Because it's a good reading too. Any final points from me? I hope that you're working well on the first assessment, writing a blog piece. I hope you're keeping up with the readings. Hope you get time to go snooping around and check out the Scythians, for instance. Don't forget that, if you're feeling squeezed for time, download the readings anyway and keep them stashed away. If you have any desire to be a historian in the future, to be a history teacher in a high school or wherever, or just to keep your mind alert, keep those readings nearby so that you can go to them and check them out, even if you don't get to read them all right now. And that's all from me. I will stop sharing and bid you all adieu. Bye-bye. Hey, dog.